August 7, 1945. Dawn broke over the Empire of Japan with a sky painted in bruised reds and greys, a horizon trembling with the aftershocks of war. The last bastion of imperial power still clung to islands and cities, battered by months of relentless bombing. Below, Tokyo smoldered, scarred from raids that had turned night into firestorms. Yet above, the heavens stirred with an unfamiliar menace. Engines roared, not with the harsh, guttural rumble of Zero fighters, but with a sharper, deeper growl that echoed like thunder rolling over the Pacific. Out of the morning haze they came, sleek, silver predators with wings outstretched, their silhouettes slicing through the sun's glare. P-51 Mustangs. To Japanese sentries scanning the horizon, the sight was disorienting. For years their skies had belonged to them. The Mitsubishi A6M0, light and nimble, once reigned supreme, a terror to clumsy Allied planes in 1941 and 1942. But now, this new American machine carved through the air with a predatory grace that defied belief. Fast, deadly, unshakable, the Mustangs flew in disciplined formations, their radios crackling with coordination. To Japanese pilots, it felt as if they were not fighting men, but a storm guided by invisible hands. At 15,000 feet, the first wave of Mustangs rolled over into a dive. Their guns spat fire, streams of .50 caliber tracers stitching the sky with lethal intent. Below them, a Japanese patrol of Ki-84 Hayates tried to intercept, banking sharply, their propellers biting into the air. But the Mustangs were faster. Their speed in the dive was blinding, their energy sustained. They struck with precision, then pulled away, climbing back into the heavens with power no Japanese machine could match. In the cockpit of a defending pilot, panic replaced pride. He pulled his Zero into a desperate climb, the stick trembling in his hands, the engine screaming for mercy. But the Mustang above him rose higher, its Packard-built Merlin engine singing a deeper song of power. In seconds, the American fighter circled above, nose tilting down, the hunter once again upon its prey. What had once been the dream of Japanese aviation supremacy was crumbling in real time, shredded in the open sky. On the ground, civilians and soldiers alike looked upward, bewildered. The American planes were not just fighters. They were escorts, guardians of the very bombers that now burned Japan's cities to ash. Before Japanese pilots could cut through bomber formations, striking at the lumbering B-29s with courage and sacrifice. Now every approach was blocked. Every climb toward a target became a duel with a machine faster, tougher, and seemingly endless in number. Witnesses spoke later of the shock that rippled through squadrons. They climbed as if pulled by the gods, one Japanese survivor recalled, and they struck like lightning, leaving no time to breathe. It was not just the machine that unsettled them, but the way it was used. The Mustangs did not fly alone. They spoke to each other through radios that never failed, directing attacks, shifting formations, covering weaknesses. It was as though the Americans had found a way to turn their squadrons into a single organism. Each engagement followed the same rhythm. The Japanese tried to swarm, to overwhelm with numbers, to use the tactics that had once made the Zero invincible. But the Mustangs did not yield. They attacked from above, retreated into climbs, then fell again with crushing force. Every duel that should have been a test of skill turned into an ambush. Every turn fight that once gave Japanese pilots confidence ended with Mustang guns tearing through fragile airframes. As the battles stretched over Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, the shock deepened. Reports flooded back to Japanese command. Pilots who survived spoke of engines that never faltered, of American planes that outran and outclimbed everything sent against them. "We were flying in the past," one lamented, "and they were flying in the future." The Mustang was not just another fighter, it was a symbol of inevitability, proof that Japan's skies were lost. Its defenses broken. Down below in the shattered cities, people had once believed their defenders could hold the heavens. That illusion vanished with the silver shadows of the Mustangs streaking overhead. Bombers roared unchallenged, their escorts cutting down any hope of resistance. Mothers pulled children into cellars as the ground shook with explosions. Soldiers watched helplessly as the machines they trusted were hunted out of the sky. To them, the arrival of the Mustang felt like the sound of a closing door, the end of an era. For the Japanese pilots themselves, it was more than defeat. It was disbelief. These were men who had trained on the myth of the Zero, who had been told their wings carried the spirit of Japan itself. Now, in desperate duels that ended in fire and smoke, they realized that spirit was no longer enough. Their machines were fragile reeds against an iron storm. Every mission became a gamble, every return to base a miracle. Morale cracked, replaced by a cold recognition. The Americans had built a fighter they could not outfly, outclimb, or outfight. The Mustangs' presence turned the war in the skies into a theater of despair. Pilots who once dove with confidence now hesitated, scanning the horizon, waiting for the silver wings that always appeared. Even the bravest acknowledged the truth. The Mustang owned the air. It was not just a contest of machines, it was a contest of time. Japan's designs belonged to the early years of the war, to 1940 and 1941, when agility and daring defined victory. But the Mustang was the weapon of 1945, a synthesis of speed, range, firepower, and coordination. It was the future unleashed upon the past, a storm no courage could withstand. And so as the sun set over Japan that August, the skies no longer belonged to the rising sun. They belonged to the silver predators circling high above, their shadows falling like omens upon a nation already at the edge of collapse. The Mustangs had come, and with them the promise of a final reckoning. By 1944, the war in the Pacific had entered its most punishing phase. The vast Japanese empire, which had stretched from the jungles of Burma to the coral atolls of the Central Pacific, was beginning to wither under the relentless advance of American forces. Island after island fell, each campaign bloodier than the last. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Leyte. The Imperial Navy, once the terror of the seas, had been crippled at Midway and bled dry at the Philippine Sea. Yet for the Japanese High Command, one hope remained: the skies over their homeland. Japan's entire defensive strategy hinged on protecting its cities and industries with fighters. The Mitsubishi Zero, the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, and the Kawanishi N1KJ Shiden were thrust forward as the guardians of the empire. The concept was simple: intercept the American bombers before they reached their targets. If the skies could be held, perhaps Japan could delay defeat long enough to bargain for peace. But this strategy rested on a fragile illusion, an illusion shattered the moment the P-51 Mustang arrived in theater. Before the Mustang, American bombing raids relied on the lumbering B-29 Superfortress, a giant in the sky that could fly higher and farther than anything before it. The Japanese feared these silver monsters, but they also knew that without proper escort, the bombers were vulnerable. Time and again, Japanese pilots tore into formations, sacrificing themselves in waves to bring the giants down. In 1944, over Yawata, Osaka, and Nagoya, American crews suffered dreadful losses. The message seemed clear: Japan's skies could still be defended, but the Americans had been preparing something different. They knew bombers alone would never win the air war. The answer came in the form of a fighter that had already proven itself over Europe. The P-51 Mustang, once dismissed as an unremarkable design, had been transformed when fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, produced under license by Packard in the United States. With speed, range, and agility unmatched by any other Allied fighter, the Mustang was the perfect escort. And when it arrived in the Pacific, the balance shifted overnight. Japanese pilots, many of them veterans of China and the South Pacific, could hardly believe what they were facing. In 1942, their Zeros had danced circles around American Wildcats and Buffaloes, turning every dogfight into a deadly ballet of tight turns and sudden bursts of gunfire. But by 1945, the tables had turned. The Mustang was faster than the Zero, sturdier than the Hayate, and able to climb with a ferocity that left Japanese pilots gasping. Worse, it carried its speed into combat, refusing to bleed energy in turning fights. For men trained in a doctrine of agility and maneuver, it was as if the rules of the game had changed overnight. The historical backdrop was stark. Japan was running out of everything: oil, aluminum, rubber, even trained pilots. Factories in Nagoya and Yokohama were bombed daily, cutting into production. Training schools turned out pilots with only a handful of hours in the air, rushed into cockpits they barely understood. By contrast, the United States had turned its vast industrial might into a war machine that seemed inexhaustible. Every month, American factories produced hundreds of Mustangs, engines roaring from Detroit assembly lines. Every squadron was trained, rested, and supplied with fuel in quantities the Japanese could no longer dream of. For the Japanese command, this was a bitter revelation. Their doctrine had been forged in the early years of the war, when surprise and superior machines gave them the edge. They had built light, nimble fighters, sacrificing armor and firepower for agility. The Zero was a masterpiece of its era, but by 1944 its thin skin and unprotected fuel tanks were liabilities. Against the Mustang's .650 caliber Browning machine guns, even the slightest hit often meant flames and death. What stunned Japanese intelligence most was not just the Mustang's performance, but its reach. From bases in Iwo Jima and the Marianas, these fighters escorted B-29s all the way to the Japanese mainland, a journey once thought impossible. Suddenly, American bombers were no longer alone. The protective wall of Mustangs shielded them, scattering interceptors, hunting stragglers, and denying Japan's fighters any chance to regroup. To the Japanese, it seemed supernatural, an enemy fighter that could cross oceans, fight at altitude, and still have fuel to return home. Reports poured in from squadron leaders. Pilots described Mustangs diving from the sun, their silver bodies flashing like blades, then disappearing into climbs too steep for pursuit. Survivors returned shaken, whispering that they had seen the future of aerial warfare. Others never returned at all, their planes consumed by fire in the skies they once dominated. In command centers, the realization grew heavier with each report. The war that had once been fought on equal terms was no longer balanced. Japan had fallen behind, not just in machines but in strategy, in industry, in time itself. Their air force was fighting the war of 1942, while the Americans were already waging the war of 1945. The Mustang was not simply an airplane. It was a symbol of inevitability, the embodiment of industrial supremacy married to technological innovation. As Tokyo smoldered, as Osaka braced for the next wave of bombers, the men at the top of Japan's command structure faced a truth they could scarcely admit aloud. The skies were lost. No doctrine, no courage, no sacrifice could bridge the gulf that the Mustang represented. For the first time in centuries, the air above the Japanese homeland belonged not to the rising sun, but to the silver wings of the invader. This was the context into which the Mustang entered, the desperate twilight of an empire, the collapse of doctrines forged in another era, and the arrival of a machine so advanced that its enemies could only watch in disbelief. It was here, in the skies over Japan, that the legend of the Mustang was written not just in victories, but in the stunned silence of those who had once believed themselves invincible. They first noticed it in the rhythm of battle. Japanese pilots, men who had spent years mastering the art of sudden attack, would climb into the sky with confidence, scanning for a weakness in the bomber formations. But each time they tried, the same thing happened. Before they could even close in, the Mustangs were there, always there, diving from unseen angles, rising into the sun, circling like wolves that anticipated every move. It was as though the Americans had eyes everywhere, as though they could hear every thought in the cockpit of their enemy. At first, Japanese intelligence dismissed it as coincidence. Perhaps the Americans were simply lucky. Perhaps they had fielded more aircraft than anticipated. But as engagements multiplied, one fact became unavoidable. The Mustang pilots always seemed to know. They knew where to strike, when to turn, when to climb. They spoke across the skies with a coordination that no Japanese squadron could match. This was the hidden advantage, the invisible weapon that made the Mustang not just a fighter, but an extension of an entire air force, the radio. The Americans had perfected a technology the Japanese had underestimated. While Imperial planes often flew with unreliable or primitive radios, the P-51 Mustang carried crystal-clear frequency modulation sets that cut through static, distance, and interference. To the men in the cockpits, this was not just equipment, it was lifeblood. They could call out enemy positions instantly, shift formations mid-fight, coordinate attacks and retreats with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. The difference was staggering. A Japanese pilot climbing alone might never know that his wingman had been shot down, or that another formation of enemy fighters was descending upon him. But in an American squadron, no man was alone. Information flowed through the airwaves like veins through a body. A Mustang squadron was not 12 separate machines. It was one organism, bound together by unseen threads of sound, The Japanese soon realized the implications. Their doctrine had been built on individual skill, on pilots dueling like swordsmen in the sky. But war in 1945 was no longer a duel. It was a system. Radios turned fighters into networks. Coordination turned squadrons into predators. To the Japanese, it felt unfair, almost unnatural. "They move as if one mind guides them," one surviving pilot reported, shaken after barely escaping an encounter. The advantage was not limited to combat maneuvers. Radios allowed the Americans to escort bombers with a vigilance that shocked their adversaries. In the past, Japanese pilots could attack from blind spots, slipping through the cracks in the bomber formations. But now a Mustang high above would call out the approach, directing his wingmen into perfect intercept positions. Every attempt to strike at the lumbering B-29s was met by a curtain of firepower, guided not by luck, but by constant, real-time communication. But the radio was only part of the hidden edge. The Mustang itself carried another secret: its range. For years, Japanese strategists had believed their homeland was untouchable, protected by the sheer vastness of the Pacific. Even when B-29s began their raids from the Marianas, Japanese commanders reassured themselves that the bombers would fly without protection. If they could only reach them, they could bleed the Americans in the skies. Then the Mustangs appeared. Flying from Iwo Jima, their tanks filled with high-octane fuel, they escorted bombers on missions over Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe, journeys of nearly 1,500 miles. This was unthinkable to Japanese planners. No fighter in their arsenal could match that range. Their interceptors could rise to meet the invaders, but they could not fly as far nor for as long. The Mustang's endurance was its second hidden blade, one that turned the skies into a battlefield where the Americans could strike at will, and the Japanese could only react. Together, radios and range created a nightmare scenario. Every battle was tilted before it began. The Japanese fought as scattered individuals, each pilot relying on instinct and outdated doctrine. The Americans fought as one, a chorus of engines and voices bound by invisible wires. The Mustang was fast, yes, and deadly, but it was these hidden advantages that truly ruled the skies. Japanese intelligence tried to adapt. They examined captured radios, dissected shot-down Mustangs, and briefed pilots on new tactics. But the gulf was too wide. Factories could not produce comparable systems in time. Oil shortages starved what few interceptors remained. And every month, more Mustangs arrived, their numbers swelling until the skies glittered with silver wings. To the Japanese pilots, it became a war not of equals, but of inevitability. They could fight with courage, even with desperation, but no amount of skill could close the gap. Again and again they launched sorties, only to find themselves outnumbered, outflown, outmaneuvered. The Mustang was not just a machine, it was a signal of an empire's fading power, of a war that could no longer be won. In the brief, bitter words of one officer, recorded after a failed interception over Nagoya, "We are not fighting men. We are fighting a system, and the system cannot be beaten." The hidden advantage was not in the steel, nor in the bullets, nor even in the wings. It was in the invisible threads that bound the Mustangs together, the voices carried across the ether, the coordination that made them feel unstoppable. To the Japanese, it was sorcery. To history, it was progress. The P-51 Mustang was more than a machine of war. It was a symphony of engineering, a weapon born from necessity and perfected through innovation. To understand why it reigned supreme over Japan's skies, one must descend into the details, the nuts, bolts, pistons, and circuits that transformed it from a promising prototype into the scourge of an empire. At its heart was the engine, a power plant that seemed almost mythical to the Japanese pilots who faced it. The Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650, a liquid-cooled V12, delivered nearly 1,700 horsepower. Unlike the radial engines of most American planes, this inline design gave the Mustang its distinctive profile, sleek, aerodynamic, and built for speed. When pushed to its limits, the Mustang could roar past 437 miles per hour at altitude, a figure that made the once-feared Zero seem sluggish in comparison. For Japanese airmen, this raw performance was unthinkable. Their fighters, designed in the early years of the war, rarely topped 330 miles per hour. Against the Mustang, they were relics, trying to chase a ghost, but speed was only part of the secret. The Mustang's laminar flow wing was a revelation, a design that reduced drag and increased efficiency at high speeds. It was subtle, invisible to the untrained eye, yet revolutionary in practice. Where Japanese fighters bled energy in every turn, the Mustang preserved it, gliding through maneuvers with grace and precision. In dogfights, this meant the American pilot could dictate the tempo, diving and climbing at will, always with energy to spare. Armament turned the Mustang into a predator. 6 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns lined its wings, each capable of spewing out 750 rounds per minute. Together, they created a storm of lead that shredded anything caught in its path. Japanese aircraft, lightly built to maximize agility, crumpled under this firepower. A few well-placed bursts could rip through fuselages, ignite fuel tanks, and send once proud Zeros tumbling in flames. The Mustang's guns were not just weapons. They were statements, overwhelming the fragility of enemy machines with sheer relentless force. And then there was the range, the feature that stunned Japanese strategists most of all. With its internal fuel tanks and 2 underwing drop tanks, the Mustang could fly over 1,600 miles without refueling. This was the weapon's true magic, its ability to follow bombers deep into enemy territory and still fight when it arrived. When Mustangs first escorted B-29s from Iwo Jima to Tokyo, Japanese defenders realized the impossible had been achieved. Their last sanctuary, the skies above their homeland, was no longer beyond reach. The Mustang had made the Pacific small. Inside the cockpit, the pilot found not just a machine, but a partner. The Mustang carried the SCR-522 radio set, a marvel of American engineering. Crystal-controlled, transmitting on VHF frequencies, it offered clarity and reliability that Japanese pilots could scarcely imagine. Where Japanese radios often hissed with static or failed entirely, the Mustang's voice was crisp, commanding, alive with coordination. Pilots could call for help, warn of threats or direct attacks in real time. To their enemies, it was as though the Americans had found a way to turn dozens of individual aircraft into a single unified predator. Every detail of the Mustang told the story of American industry at war. Factories in Detroit, Inglewood, and Dallas turned out airframes at staggering rates. Packard engines rolled off assembly lines, with precision unheard of in Japan's strained workshops. Radios were produced by companies like Bendix and Motorola, mass-manufactured, standardized, dependable. The Mustang was not the triumph of one genius designer, but of an industrial nation, harnessing its full might. Contrast this with Japan. By 1945, their factories were shattered by bombing raids, their supplies of aluminum and fuel dwindling. Their fighters, though brave in conception, were rushed into service with flaws left unresolved. The Ki-84 Hayate, one of Japan's best late-war fighters, was formidable on paper. Fast, heavily armed, a worthy rival. But poor fuel quality left engines prone to failure. Materials shortages weakened airframes. Radios often malfunctioned. What might have been a competitor to the Mustang became, in practice, another symbol of Japan's decline. Technical comparisons tell the tale in brutal clarity. Mustang versus Zero, 437 mph against 331 mph. Mustang climb rate, 3,200 feet per minute, far above Japan's aging fighters. Mustang armament, 6 heavy machine guns against 2 or 4 lighter weapons. Range nearly double. The numbers were not abstract. They were fatal. In battle, every difference was magnified. A Mustang could escape at will, could climb to safety, could strike from altitude with impunity. Japanese pilots entered the fight already disadvantaged, their machines outclassed before the first burst of gunfire. Even maintenance told the story. Mustangs were rugged, designed for field repair. Engines could be swapped, radios recalibrated, guns reloaded with efficiency. Japanese planes, delicate and complex, often required hours of work for minimal returns. Each Mustang was not just a fighter, it was a sustainable weapon of war. In every bolt, every gear, every circuit, the Mustang carried America's hidden advantage, the ability to turn science into steel, blueprints into mass production, prototypes into fleets. It was not the fastest fighter in the world, nor the most heavily armed, but it was the perfect balance of speed, firepower, endurance, and coordination. It was, in every sense, the right weapon at the right time. For Japanese pilots, The technical gulf was not an abstract calculation. It was lived reality, felt in the roar of an engine that could not be outrun, in the sudden storm of fire that no armor could resist, in the sight of a silver wing climbing into the heavens where no Zero could follow. The Mustang was not just a machine. It was proof that Japan had fallen behind in the most unforgiving race of all, the race of technology. And in war, there is no mercy for those who fall behind. September 12, 1944. The French countryside around the town of Haraucourt was blanketed in a pale morning mist, the fields heavy with dew, the sky muted in shades of grey. For the Wehrmacht, the Lorraine region was a battlefield of desperation, a chance to halt the advancing American tide after the breakout from Normandy. German commanders threw forward their prized machines, Panther tanks, steel beasts that had terrified the Red Army on the Eastern Front. Yet above the hedgerows and villages, another kind of predator stalked the battlefield. Engines thundered in the distance, sharp and high-pitched. The Mustangs were coming. It was here over Haraucourt that the P-51's power would be proven beyond doubt. American forces faced an armored counterattack of nearly 75 German tanks. To meet this steel onslaught, the U.S. Army unleashed its armored divisions and, most critically, its air cover. Squadrons of P-51s rose from forward bases, climbing into the sky with tanks of high-octane fuel slung beneath their wings. Their mission: deny the Germans any freedom of movement. What followed would become a case study in how air power could break even the most formidable enemy. As the first Panthers rumbled across the fields, their treads grinding mud into steel tracks, radio chatter lit up Mustang cockpits. Spotters on the ground relayed German positions. Pilots acknowledged with clipped voices, their radios carrying every syllable clearly, unmarred by static. Then, like hawks descending from the heavens, the Mustangs dove. Their guns barked, 650 calibers each pouring fire into columns of trucks and half-tracks. Fuel convoys erupted in orange blossoms of flame. Ammunition wagons detonated in thunderclaps that shook the earth. The Panthers pressed on, but already their lifeline, supplies, was being shredded from above. Japanese pilots over their homeland would later face this same storm, but here in France the blueprint was written. The Mustang was more than a duelist. It was a scalpel that cut arteries of war. When the Luftwaffe scrambled to respond, its fighters found themselves outmatched. Bf-109s and FW-190s, once dominant, were now prey. Mustangs pounced from altitude, using their superior climb and dive to dictate every engagement. German pilots, many fresh from the Eastern Front, were shocked at the speed and coordination of their enemy. One German after-action report spoke of the frustration. They struck like ghosts. Wherever we turned, there they were. Our radios could not coordinate fast enough. It was as if they knew our plans before we moved. This bewilderment mirrored what Japanese pilots would later feel. An enemy that seemed to anticipate every decision, an opponent who never fought alone, losses mounted. By day's end, 86 German tanks were destroyed or abandoned. Many had fallen not to American Shermans, but to the unrelenting strikes of P-51s and P-47s overhead. The German attack had been gutted before it could even fully deploy. Haraucourt became more than a victory. It was proof that the era of armored dominance was ending, replaced by skies ruled by coordinated, long-range fighters. Fast forward to the Pacific, and the lesson of Haraucourt became prophecy. The Japanese Air Force, though different in doctrine, would suffer the same fate. Over Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, the Mustangs repeated the script: intercept, overwhelm, annihilate. A Japanese formation would rise with courage, engines straining. But before they could reach the bombers, Mustangs fell upon them in disciplined waves. Radios guided every move, one squadron distracting, another flanking, a third diving for the kill. It was Haraucourt in the skies, with Japanese fighters standing in place of Panthers. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. At Haraucourt, American losses were fewer than 25 tanks. In Japan, the ratio of air combat was even more lopsided. For every Mustang lost, multiple Japanese fighters fell, often in flames before they had even closed to firing range. The technical advantages, the Merlin engine, the range, the Browning guns were amplified by coordination, turning battles into massacres. Japanese pilots could not understand it. Reports filed after raids described Mustangs appearing from nowhere, diving with impossible precision, then vanishing before counterattacks could form. "They strike and they vanish," one officer noted bitterly. "We cannot hold them. We cannot even see them until it is too late." It was the same bewilderment the Germans had voiced at Aracourt, the same sense of fighting an enemy whose power came not from individual machines, but from the system that bound them together. For the civilians watching from the ground, the effect was terrifying. In France, farmers hid in cellars as burning columns stretched across fields. In Japan, mothers and children cowered as firestorms rose from cities, the silver wings of Mustangs circling like sentinels above. In both theaters, the message was clear: resistance was futile. Wherever the Mustang appeared, it ruled. The battle at Aracourt and the raids over Japan were separated by oceans, by enemies, by cultures. Yet they told the same story. The Mustang was not merely a fighter. It was a hammer that broke armies, a scalpel that cut lifelines, a guardian that denied the enemy hope. In Europe, it shattered German armor. In Japan, it crushed the last defenders of the homeland. In both cases, the pattern was unmistakable: speed, coordination, and firepower wielded with surgical precision. When the wreckage was counted, commanders understood. The age of the Mustang had arrived. Armies could no longer move freely. Skies could no longer be defended by outdated machines. And for the Japanese, watching their finest interceptors fall in flames over Tokyo, the lesson was brutal. What had happened to the Germans at Aracourt was now their fate. The Mustang had proven itself in Europe. Over Japan, it would prove itself again, with consequences far more devastating. By the summer of 1945, the P-51 Mustang had become more than a fighter. It was a shadow over Japan's future, a symbol of inevitability that weighed heavily on pilots, commanders, and civilians alike. The strategic impact was immediate, devastating, and undeniable. Yet it was the psychological toll that dug deepest, gnawing at the spirit of an empire that had once dreamed of eternal skies. For the Americans, the arrival of the Mustang meant their bombers no longer flew alone. The B-29 superfortresses that once trembled at the thought of interception now thundered confidently toward their targets, encased in silver guardians. Squadrons of Mustangs escorted them like wolves circling a herd, always alert, always ready to strike. The strategic effect was catastrophic for Japan. Before the Mustang, interceptors had some hope of breaking through, of slashing at bomber formations and crippling the offensive. After the Mustang, every attempt ended in slaughter. Japan's last defense, the belief that their skies could not be wholly taken, was erased. This new reality shattered morale within the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service. Pilots who once considered themselves heirs to the legacy of Pearl Harbor and the conquest of Southeast Asia were now reduced to pawns in a hopeless struggle. Veteran aviators, those who had flown in China or over the Coral Sea, recognized the futility. They saw green recruits climb into cockpits with barely 100 hours of training, only to be cut down within minutes by Mustangs whose pilots had logged hundreds of combat hours, supported by radios that gave them the advantage of near-telepathic coordination. Reports filtered back to headquarters, kill ratios that defied belief, missions where entire squadrons vanished without inflicting a single casualty. Commanders read the numbers in silence, understanding the implication. Japan could no longer contest the air war. Without air superiority, the defense of cities, industries, and supply lines was a fantasy. The Mustang had stolen the sky itself, but beyond the statistics lay the psychological devastation. Pilots described the Mustang as omnipresent, a predator that could not be evaded. "We thought we had slipped past them," one survivor wrote after returning from a mission over Osaka. "Then they appeared above us, diving as if they had been waiting the whole time." To fight under those conditions was to accept constant fear, to fly with the knowledge that the enemy was always watching, always listening, always ready to strike. The American advantage in radios intensified this sense of futility. Japanese pilots often flew in isolation, unable to communicate once battle was joined. A pilot could see his comrades fall one by one, but he could not call for help, could not warn the others, could not shift strategy mid-fight. Meanwhile, Mustang squadrons fought like a single organism. One pilot under attack would call for cover, and within seconds a wingman would swoop in. Another would announce enemy altitude, and the entire squadron would pivot in unison. To the Japanese, it was like fighting not individuals, but a machine intelligence that never faltered. The psychological impact rippled far beyond the cockpits. Civilians, once reassured by the sight of Japanese interceptors rising to meet the bombers, now watched in despair as those same interceptors were torn from the sky before their eyes. Children pointed at the contrails above Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, long silver lines etched against blue, and whispered of the white dragons that no sword could slay. Mothers knew the truth. The sky no longer belonged to Japan. This despair fed into the larger collapse of Japanese strategy. The Army and Navy had long emphasized spirit, the notion that courage and sacrifice could overcome material weakness. Kamikaze pilots embodied this belief, hurling themselves at American ships in a desperate bid to prove willpower could change fate. But in the skies over Japan, the Mustang proved spirit was not enough. Courage could not close the speed gap. Sacrifice could not overcome radios that turned squadrons into single-minded predators. Even the bravest pilot willing to die often never reached his target. Strategically, the Mustang made the firebombing campaign unstoppable. Entire cities were reduced to ashes, Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, because the Mustangs cleared the skies. No Japanese fighter could break through. No defense could be mounted. The Americans exploited this advantage mercilessly, launching raids of hundreds of bombers, each shielded by silver escorts that struck down any resistance. For the Japanese leadership, the message was unavoidable. Without control of the skies, the homeland could not be defended. Psychologically, the effect was corrosive. Japanese officers admitted in private that morale was collapsing. Recruits no longer believed in victory. Civilians no longer believed in defense. Even senior commanders, men who once spoke of honor and destiny, began to acknowledge the truth. The Mustang had taken away the one thing Japan could not replace: hope. The psychological edge extended to the Americans as well. For their pilots, the Mustang became a symbol of invincibility. Men who had once feared the Zero now flew with confidence. They knew their machines were superior, their radios reliable, their numbers overwhelming. That confidence translated into aggression, into relentless pursuit, into a belief that every battle was already decided. And in war, belief is as powerful as bullets. In the end, the Mustang's greatest victory was not in the number of planes it destroyed or the missions it escorted. Its greatest victory was in the minds of those who faced it. The Japanese could no longer imagine winning the skies. They flew into battle already defeated, their courage crushed beneath the silver shadow of a machine that seemed untouchable. The Mustang had turned the air war into a psychological war, and it was a war Japan could not win. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the ruins of Japan smoldered beneath a sky that no longer belonged to the rising sun. The P-51 Mustang, sleek and silver, had not only ruled those skies, it had rewritten the very doctrine of air warfare. Its legacy stretched far beyond the burned-out shells of Japanese fighters or the shattered cities below. It became a symbol, a lesson etched into the memory of nations, generals, and generations to come. The Japanese pilots who survived the onslaught spoke with awe and bitterness of the machine that seemed to move faster than thought, that struck with precision and disappeared into the clouds. "We built fighters for men," one officer later reflected. They built fighters for nations. The Mustang was not a triumph of individual skill, but of collective power, the culmination of engineering, industry, and doctrine fused into a single weapon. In the years after the war, the Mustang's influence was undeniable. The Cold War dawned in the shadow of its wings. Air forces around the world studied its balance of speed, range, and firepower. Nations realized that air combat was no longer about dueling aces in fragile machines. It was about networks, coordination, and endurance. From Korea to Vietnam, Mustangs continued to fly, their Merlin engines roaring across new battlefields, their silhouettes still feared. The Japanese, rebuilding from ruin, absorbed the lesson with humility. Their post-war aircraft industry, under American supervision, shifted toward technology, precision, and systems rather than blind reliance on agility or spirit. The myths of invincibility that had guided their wartime doctrine were shattered. In their place grew a respect for integration, radar, radios, engineering, all the hidden threads that had given the Mustang its edge. The Mustang's legacy was not only technical, but psychological. For American pilots, it was proof that superiority was achievable, that with the right blend of design and doctrine, they could dominate even the most determined foe. This confidence shaped future strategies, from NATO defense in Europe to carrier operations in the Pacific. The idea of network-centric warfare, the concept that victory comes not from isolated strength, but from coordinated systems, was born in those skies over Japan. In the Gulf War decades later, American jets swept aside Iraqi defenses with the same philosophy. Connection over isolation, coordination over chaos. Radios had evolved into data links, Mustangs into F-15s and F-16s, but the principle remained the same. The seed planted in 1945 had grown into the very structure of modern air combat. For Japan, the memory was sobering. Pilots who once soared with pride had watched their comrades fall in flames, powerless against an enemy they could neither outfly nor outfight. Families on the ground had learned that courage alone could not shield them from the storm. The Mustang was a reminder that wars are won not only with bravery, but with progress, preparation, and unity. Even today, veterans speak of the Mustang with reverence. Its roar is remembered not only as the sound of victory, but as the voice of inevitability. Its wings carried more than bullets. They carried the weight of a nation's industrial might, the spirit of engineers who refused to accept limits, the determination of pilots who flew farther and fought harder because their machines allowed it. The Germans had admitted as much when their own war ended. "We built better tanks," one general remarked, "but you built tanks that worked together." The same truth applied to the skies. Japan built fighters of elegance and daring, but America built fighters that fought as one. The Mustang was not the sharpest sword, nor the heaviest hammer, but it was the weapon of a system, and systems win wars. As the sun set on the war in the Pacific, a final lesson lingered in the smoke above Japan's ruined cities. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, endurance outweighs agility, and speed defeats armor. The Mustang embodied all three. It ruled the skies not because it was invincible, but because it was inevitable, the product of a nation that understood the future. And so the silver wings of the Mustang became more than an image of victory. They became a warning, a promise, and a legacy. For those who watched it soar above Japan in those final months, it was the sound of destiny. For history, it was proof that the future belongs to those who fly not alone but together.